Good evening, and welcome to our second conversation in our ninth annual Touro University, California Social Justice and Public Health Speaker Series, hosted by the Public Health Program at Touro University. My name is Gail Cummings, and I am the director of the Public Health Program, and I'm joined by Dr. Deirdre Wilson, who serves as the chair for the Community Action for Health concentration in the Master of Public Health Program here at TUC. And together we host the Social Justice and Public Health Speaker Series. Before we begin today's webinar, we want to make sure we are mindful and pause as a reminder and reflect that regardless of where we are all sitting on stolen land. The city of Vallejo, which is home of Touro University, California, exists on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Confederate villages of the Lijan, Carquin, the Mawakama, and the Patwin peoples. We also want to pause and remember that our country is built on the labor of enslaved people who were kidnapped and brought to the U.S. from the African continent, and recognize that the continued contribution of our survivors, and we want to acknowledge that continued contribution. We also want to acknowledge that all immigrant labor, including voluntary, involuntary, trafficked, forced, and undocumented peoples who have contributed to building this country and continue to serve in our labor force. And as we all do this work, it remains our collective responsibility to pause and critically understand these histories, to repair harm that has impacted generations, and to honor, protect, and sustain this land. So if this is your first time joining us, again, welcome. The purpose of this series is to provide upstream discussions around social justice and public health for students in our MPH programs and professionals in the public health field, medicine, education, pharmacy, and nursing degree programs, as well as for our community and global partners. Each year, we focus on a different topic, and as Dr. Wilson has announced, this year's topic is the impacts of technology on health equity and social justice. So over the course of the next 5 sessions of this year's series, we will continue to hear from leading experts across diverse fields of health policy, public health, technoscience, history, and social justice, who will help us understand the current technology landscape with discussions centered around how it is developed, deployed, and regulated, which can both promote and undermine social justice and health equity. We've been extremely fortunate to bring some remarkable speakers to this series over the last 8 years. We launched this year's series with Dr. Ruha Benjamin, who provided a groundbreaking analysis on race, technology, and social justice, focusing on big structural changes necessary for health equity. And we are tremendously excited to follow up this week with Professor Molly Turner in a conversation on urban policy centered around the intersections of technology, urban life, governance, and the built environment and its impact on health equity and social justice. Before I turn it over to Dr. Wilson, I would like to also add that it was Molly Turner's podcast, Technopolis, that was the spark for this year's Social Justice and Public Health series. This particular podcast was really helpful in helping us connect the dots around innovation and technology as a determinant of health. And it really helped to kind of explain some of the conversations that we were having around digital equity, innovation in city and urban planning. This particular series looked at conversations around self-driving cars, for example, with technoscientists, filmmakers, and researchers, all exploring what needs to change in order for technology to improve social and economic and health equity. So while Technopolis is currently on pause, you can still hear episodes from 2019 located on Spotify and other platforms where podcasts are hosted. Now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Deirdre Wilson, who will introduce Molly and provide a little more housekeeping before we begin. Thank you.
Good evening again. Just a reminder to our students that the Canvas course and course information is available through the Canvas course. I'd also like to remind all participants that at the end of this presentation today, we will have the opportunity for questions and answers that are only available during the, if you place the Q&A and your questions in the Q&A function. And I'd also like to remind you all that continuing education opportunities are available for CME as well. And those opportunities are listed in the chat. So as we go on and here these continuing medical education opportunities are available, please be assured that the link and activity code will be in the chat. I'd also like to remind you that we have a Touro University Social Justice Badge that is also available for viewing and answering questions related to each of our sessions. So if you're interested, there's a link in the chat. We also have a Socially Just podcast, if you're interested, which highlights speakers from each of the sessions of our Social Justice Speaker Series. This podcast was made available starting last fall. So if you're interested in hearing different podcasts from our previous Social Justice Speaker Series, you can listen to that on our link. And last but not least, there is a link to Molly Turner's Technopolis also in the chat. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Molly Turner. She's a leading expert on technology, startups, and cities. Through her teaching at the Berkeley Haas, and her work in the field, she has shaped the contemporary conversation about technology's impact on urban life and governance. At Haas, Turner teaches the popular class Tech and the City, How to Get Urban Innovation Right, to graduate MBAs. Turner is deeply engaged in contemporary urban policy and tech issues through her advisory work with city leaders and civic tech startups, and her service on the boards of urban policy think tank Spur and nonprofit affordable housing developer Bridge Housing. Before teaching at Haas, Turner was an early employee of Airbnb, where she established the company's public policy team in 2011. As the global head of civic partnerships, Turner directed Airbnb's partnerships with governments around the world, including its international disaster response program, neighborhood tourism development program, and 2015 launch in Cuba. Before Airbnb, Turner worked for the San Francisco Mayor's Office of Economic Development, the UNESCO World Heritage Cities Program, and an urban planning consulting firm. Molly Turner holds a master's in urban planning from Harvard University and a BA from Dartmouth College. Please join me in welcoming Professor Molly Turner.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. It's a real pleasure to be here and to speak to all of you. I look forward to engaging with you and hearing your questions later in the session. But first, I put together a couple slides to start off our conversation. And of course, it's always helpful when you're talking about the built environment and cities to actually look at some pictures, because so much of what we're talking about is in the physical world, and it can be very valuable to see and feel the cities that we're talking about. So today I get to talk to you about the built environment, the places that we call cities, whether big cities or small cities. Cities are the physical manifestation of people living together in close proximity with each other. And the built environment that we create that becomes these cities is just that physical manifestation of people. And I think that's important to remember. And I'm going to come back to that theme at the end of my talk. I'm an urban planner by training, And I spend a lot of my time thinking about and teaching about the impacts of technology on how we build and manage our cities. And of course, technology has always transformed cities, intentionally and sometimes not so intentionally. In the 19th century, the streetcar, the steam train, the elevator, the latest technologies of their times transformed cities. They increased density and they transformed what cities look like. Just look at this aerial view of Manhattan. Trains shaped the city grid. The city's buildings were built densely close to each other along this grid so that people could walk to the train from work or home. Elevators led the city to be built taller and taller and more densely, as you no longer had to walk upstairs, but could push a button and get in a machine and go up 30 floors to the top of a building. So those technologies transformed how a city like New York looked in the 19th century. In the 20th century, the internal combustion engine, which powers cars, had a massive impact on cities. Look at Chicago, for example. You can see the tall downtown, much like Manhattan, shaped by trains and elevators. But it is surrounded by a web of roads that shoot out radially from the center city, which are surrounded by low-density single-family homes. This is an infrastructure that was built for a different technology, cars. And the infrastructure we built to accommodate it was the interstate highway system, which opened up land farther and farther away from the city center for development and shaped the region around Chicago as you see it today. Look at these two contrasting models of cities that different technologies have helped to shape. One on the left is dense and urban, and one on the right is low density and sprawling and suburban. And we know that these two different models of cities have different implications on our health. The denser cities tend to be more walkable, less car dependent, whereas the suburban cities tend to require a car. There are many suburbs, in fact, that don't even have sidewalks. They don't have that physical infrastructure for walking. Denser cities tend to be more sociable, whereas suburban, sprawling cities have tended to lead to more loneliness. In fact, Robert Putnam wrote an entire book, Bowling Alone, about how the suburbanization of America and the more time everyone spent in their cars has led to greater loneliness. And of course, much has been written about the public health impacts of different urban forms. I'm not an expert on that, but I can tell you that urban design absolutely impacts how we live, how we work, and how we play. And what I am an expert on is how technologies are influencing the ways that our cities are designed and managed. And so what I'm going to talk to you about tonight is how the latest technologies are influencing how our cities look and how we live in them. And there are plenty of new technologies that have the power to transform cities and how we live in them. Just like they did in the 19th and 20th centuries, we've got plenty of new technologies today. But these technologies are not always developed with cities in mind. That doesn't make them any less impactful on cities. Take, for example, the smartphone. When Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone in 2007, I'm not so sure that he or anyone else knew just how much it would transform our cities. Just pause and think for a second. Think of all of the ways the smartphone, if you have one, has transformed your experience of cities. And if you don't have one, how it has cut you off from so many opportunities in cities today. Our smartphones have allowed those who have them to interact with cities and the people who live them in so many new ways. Just a handful of many examples. You can access door-to-door on-demand transportation with Uber, on-demand food delivery with DoorDash, easy navigation wherever you need to go with Waze, and even easy socializing with Tinder. But of course, it's not just our phones that are transforming urban life. I want to review some other technologies that I believe will have a big impact on our cities. And I don't need to tell you how important affordable, safe, and stable housing is to health. Just look at the impact that the lack of affordable housing has had on health outcomes here in the Bay Area over recent decades. Well, there are a lot of new technologies and new businesses being developed to deploy them that are trying to make housing more plentiful and more affordable. One example that you see here on the screen is what we call prefab, or modular housing. In other words, housing that is built in a factory. Sometimes it's what's called panelized, where like an entire wall with everything that you'd have on that wall, cabinets and utilities, is integrated into the panel of the wall. And those walls are put together into a box, and then, like you see here, craned onto the site where the housing is going to rest. Sometimes these housing units are built 3D in a factory with new 3D printing technology and craned and trucked onto a site. By building housing in a factory, that can speed up the time to build, reduce a lot of the complexity of building on site, and reduce the costs associated with producing one housing unit. But it is very difficult to figure out. Here you see a granny flat or an accessory dwelling unit going in someone's backyard. Much easier to build that than to build a multifamily apartment building in a factory. But I will tell you, Bridge Housing, the nonprofit affordable housing developer I'm on the board of, has tried it twice, and it's been quite tough, but there are actually 2 buildings in the Bay Area that you can go visit that have been built in a factory. Another approach that has some promise is not prefabricating the entire building, but prefabricating parts of it. For example, kitchens. Kitchens are pretty complicated to build or renovate in a housing unit, and they can be quite expensive. Well, there are companies that have designed modular kitchens, like you see here, that have all of the utilities fully integrated into them that you can stick inside any kind of building. And in fact, there is a lot of interest in putting these types of prefabricated kitchens inside office buildings or inside hotels to convert them into housing units. So when we talk about the future of downtown and of offices in the Bay Area, there may be an opportunity to convert some of these buildings by using this type of technology. And the last example here I'll share, which is a pretty wild example and doesn't necessarily make housing super affordable yet, but that's robotic furniture. Think of the Murphy bed, the bed that you can pull down from the wall. Well, this takes this to a whole new level. This is a robotic apartment where everything, the bed, the sofa, the dresser, the table, is connected to a system in the ceiling that can come down and retract based on what you need. What that means is you can live in a much smaller space than you would otherwise. Now, this isn't for everyone, but this certainly might lead to our ability to build more housing units for more people closer to jobs in transit where people need to get, if we can be more efficient with our space. All of these new technologies for housing have the promise to reduce costs, speed up construction, and hopefully provide more affordable housing for folks who need it. There's also some new technologies that are being developed to make our housing healthier, both for us who live in housing and for the environment. One example that I'll share with you are heat pumps that power and heat and cool our homes with geothermal heating. They replace the gas furnace, which there has been much to do about lately, about how horrible gas furnaces and stoves are for our health. And they replace that by tapping into the ground to heat and cool our home. Of course, not everybody can replace their gas furnace with a heat pump. That's both technically complicated to do on your own and can be quite expensive. Luckily, there are some tech companies that have emerged recently to help lower income households get access to these new technologies in their homes, to remove health hazards and to upgrade HVAC systems. One is based here in the Bay Area, Revalue.io. There's another company that has also created a tech platform to help developers and managers of subsidized affordable housing units. And it's helping them upgrade the utilities in their buildings to be healthier and safer and more sustainable. But of course, not all tech companies that are working on housing are improving life for residents. We should beware of companies that say they're helping low-income households, but in fact, they're just predatory new business models. For example, many of the new rent-to-own startups pose a risk of this, as my friends who run the Tech Equity Collaborative explain in this excellent report that they published recently. With this rent-to-own model, the tech startup will buy a home for you, rent it back to you until you can purchase it and you've saved up enough money to purchase it back from them at a price that you have agreed on. That sounds too good to be true, and in some cases, it often is. many of these startups that are doing this, and there are many, don't have good records on conversion, which means they're buying the properties, they're renting them out, and the residents never manage to purchase the properties. And that is just a recreation of predatory contract buying practices that many Black households were victims of in the last century, just with new technology today. So just because a company says it's innovating in housing doesn't mean that it's creating a positive innovation for the people who need housing most. The same goes for mobility. There are so many new tech companies building solutions for getting around cities. And let me remind you that housing and mobility are inextricably linked. Where you live and how far it is for you to get to work and school and where you need to go can have a huge impact on your quality of life. And so we need better solutions for getting around cities. But it can be hard for us to understand whether these new technologies are actually helping us get around cities more equitably, sustainably, efficiently, or not. So let me share a couple examples. E-scooters. Over the past several years, electric scooters have taken over city streets and sidewalks. They're battery-powered, little miniature clean vehicles, most of which can't drive more than 15 miles per hour, so at a pretty safe speed. They can be rented by the minute, and they can help you get where you need to go, whether that's when you get off the train and you still got a mile to walk and you hop on a scooter, or you take a scooter instead of getting in a car in the first place. On the one hand, these e-scooters emerging overnight have caused a lot of problems in cities. They've been a tripping hazard when people just leave them willy-nilly on the sidewalk. People driving these e-scooters have collided with pedestrians and cyclists and cars. And so they can be quite dangerous when not used responsibly. On the other hand, e-scooters can be a great climate-friendly way to get around town because they can induce people to get out of their cars and onto a more environmentally sustainable mode of transportation. They can also be a great active mobility option that is good for health, getting people walking and moving more instead of sitting behind a steering wheel. And they can provide a great new option for people who are not well served by existing mobility options, whether because they don't own a car or because they're not well served by public transit. And just for fun, scooters can mean freedom and excitement for young people. And it's probably not a surprise that a lot of the people we see riding these things are young people who don't have access to cars. So some have said scooters are dangerous. There are too many accidents. We need to outlaw them. Others would say, no, it's cars that are dangerous. We should be making room for scooters. It can be really easy to blame the new technology for these problems. But if you think about it, the real problem is that we have allocated most of our roadway to cars. Cars that are bad for the environment, bad for our health, bad for equity, and bad for urban life. Scooters are dangerous because there is nowhere for them to ride safely. If they ride on the sidewalk, they might hit a pedestrian. But if they ride in the street, they might get hit by a car. There are no good options for this new technology. So should we blame it? Should we blame the scooters? Or should we use this opportunity to rethink how we should allocate our street space and who it should be allocated for? This conversation is already happening in cities around the world. Paris, during the pandemic, has shut many roads permanently to cars, allowing bicycles and pedestrians to take over the streets. Interesting quick side note, Paris has also just outlawed e-scooters in a very controversial decision. San Francisco has added more protected bike lanes, hoping that scooters as well as bikes will have a safer place in our streets off of our sidewalks to roam. Another new technology that is competing for space on our roads is autonomous vehicles, or AVs, robot-driven cars. If you've spent any time in San Francisco lately, you've probably seen them everywhere. They look like this. They've got a big LiDAR bump on top of the car that's doing all the hard work to navigate it. And autonomous vehicles are often promoted as a solution to so many of our urban problems. In particular, they are touted as a solution for street safety. When a human is no longer behind the wheel and a robot is driving, we will eliminate human error and can program the robot to never hit another human or animal again. In other words, there will be no more accidents, no more traffic fatalities, one of the leading causes of death in this country. Sure, maybe robots will be better drivers than humans one day, but the technology has a long way to go before we get there. In the meantime, today in San Francisco, autonomous vehicles have been getting in the way of emergency responders, blocking them from going to help people who are in dire need. But let's assume, for the benefit of the doubt, that the autonomous vehicle companies can fix that bug, and that one day these vehicles will be perfect, that nobody will ever get hit by a car again. What would our city streets be like? Would it be a futuristic, completely safe utopia? Let's think about that for a minute. Imagine you're working in downtown San Francisco, and it's a rainy winter night, and you forgot your umbrella, unlike the person in this image. And you're walking home to make it in time for dinner. And you're standing on the corner waiting for the light to change so you can cross the street. And in the meantime, it's just pouring rain on you. If you know that every single vehicle in that road is an autonomous vehicle and is programmed to stop before it hits you, what would prevent you from just jaywalking and crossing the street? And what would prevent every other pedestrian in downtown San Francisco that evening from doing the exact same thing and bringing all car traffic to a complete standstill? Well, that doesn't really work, does it? That completely negates the need for an autonomous vehicle if the vehicles can't even navigate in that type of scenario or go anywhere. If you were one of these companies building the autonomous vehicle technology, and I've talked to people at these companies who are, this is a really big problem that they need to figure out. And there are not a lot of great solutions to it. A variety have been proposed over recent years. One, separate the pedestrians from the vehicles, whether in tunnels or bridges, or even erecting fences along sidewalks to prevent people from walking in the street when they're not supposed to. Another idea that has been proposed is to increase enforcement of jaywalking. Make it really hard to cross the street when you're not supposed to, by significantly increasing fines, maybe using facial recognition so that every single person who jaywalks is caught. It would basically be a police state. Again, these are solutions that have actually been proposed by people. I don't know about you, but I don't really want to live in a city where I'm confined to a tunnel or a bridge when I want to walk around, or where I have to have cameras looking at my face all the time and sending me $5,000 tickets when I step into the street. In fact, apparently a lot of Californians don't want to live in a place like that. Our state legislature just recently decriminalized jaywalking because it has had such disparate impacts on communities of color and led to over-policing and terrible outcomes. While these solutions I've shared with you are no good, there aren't a lot of better ones. We need more creative minds to work on this problem if we're going to figure out how to make autonomous vehicles work in a way that makes our cities better for everybody. But it can often feel like autonomous vehicles are inevitable, like they're happening to us in our cities, whether we like it or not. And in fact, the way I framed my question was intentionally to make it feel inevitable. I said, how should these companies prevent people from getting in their way and bringing all traffic to a halt? But I could have asked a different question. I could have asked, what is the best way to get this person who's standing in the rain most efficiently, most equitably, most sustainably where they need to go? And what is the best way to do that for everybody else who needs to get around the city? By posing that different question, we might have gotten different answers. And those answers likely wouldn't have included autonomous vehicles. They probably would have included bicycles, buses, trains. These are not sexy new technologies. But as you can see here from a famous image that shows how many people each of these modes of transit moves and how much roadway space they take up. These modes of transit move people more efficiently, more sustainably, and more equitably than a car does. I share this example to make an important point. I've told you about some technologies that are impacting urban life today, and I can't predict what future ones will be. I don't know what types of technologies might impact urban life and our health in 5 or 10 or 20 years. But I can tell you that there's a different way we can think about technologies as they emerge. That we don't have to take their developers' pitches at face value. That we should always ask ourselves when faced with a new technology, what problem is this technology solving? And is it the right problem to solve? By understanding the underlying urban problem, it will help you figure out what the best urban solution is. And sometimes that solution is a shiny new technology. Sometimes it's a sturdy old one. And sometimes it's not a technology at all. It's a law or a policy. And that's because most urban problems are far too complex to be programmed into an app. Constructing a building takes a lot longer than constructing a website. And undoing the racist legacy of many urban policies is more complicated than pushing through a software update. In other words, urban technology can be a great tool, but technology alone is not going to fix cities. Thank you, and I look forward to chatting with you now.
So much, Molly. We really appreciate your take on technology, the built environment, and it gives us a lot to think about with regards to how changes in technology really affects health and I think more importantly, kind of the social inequities that can present themselves in how technology is used or isn't used. So we do have some general questions as you all are populating the Q&A function with your questions for Professor Turner. Please use the Q&A function. It helps us to see who's first. But until then, Professor Cummings, Dr. Cummings will lead us in our questions.
Yes, thank you, Professor Turner. That was really thought-provoking, especially that last image of sort of the three highways and how much actual space is used with cars versus bikes and walking. These are things that we don't necessarily obviously consider given the century that we're living in, but I do think it does pose that important question that you raised around technology not always being that answer, and that sort of the old sturdy existing tools that we have, maybe making those better as another way of moving forward. So while we kind of all marinate on some of those ideas, I did have sort of an overarching question in that understanding, where we are in terms of technology and innovation, which for many of us, it feels like it's on steroids. And we do understand that there are quite a few benefits, but also, detriments to equitable society. And you did touch on sort of what are some of the best practices for really trying to discern how we either embrace or reject or, proceed with caution. But can you talk a little bit more about that? What are some of better practices in really kind of understanding how technology can impact our health?
Sure. So this is something I work on a lot. And I've helped over the years cities figure out, should we allow these new technologies to be deployed? And I've also helped the companies that are building new technologies figure out, how do we convince people that what we're doing is actually going to be really good for cities? That's really hard, especially because just inherently by the way these new technologies are created, they're new. right? We're just building them until we see them out in the world and test them and see, it's hard to know whether they're going to have the types of impacts that they say they will. And it's also hard to know what types of unintended impacts they might have, because there are lots of ways that humans can ruin the plan, right? We're very clever sometimes and can find ways to circumvent things, or new technology might change our behavior in ways that are really hard to anticipate. One example of this is Uber and Lyft and what are called TNCs, transportation network companies. Some people call them ride hail, right? This on-demand call a car to pick you up from your phone. When these companies were first pitched, they were pitched as a way to reduce car ownership and reduce congestion in cities. And I'll tell you, I can't speak for Uber, but I know the founders of Lyft, and I talked to them back when they first launched this company. I can tell you, they very much founded Lyft with the hope that it would be good for the environment and reduce congestion. That's why, if you recall, Lyft was launched more as hey, get in your friend's car. We have a friendly pink mustache on the front of the car. And you fist bump the driver. However, as the companies grew, what we soon learned when smart academics and city leaders started looking at the data was these companies were pulling people off of public transit. They were competing with the bus and the train and inducing more trips by car. So a trip that you might have taken by foot or by bicycle or by bus, you're now taking by car instead. And they were increasing congestion in cities significantly. Now, that's an unfortunate consequence. And sure, maybe we could have predicted that would happen. And maybe we could have regulated these businesses earlier on to prevent that from happening, whether by requiring that every Lyft or Uber vehicle pick up multiple people. If you recall, there was a time when both companies tried this model called Uber Pool or Lyft Line, where they would stop multiple times along a route and pick up strangers, kind of like a bus. That might have reduced congestion, but that business model didn't work out. Maybe we could have required that. Or maybe, as some cities, including San Francisco and New York, are considering right now, a policy called congestion pricing might have helped, where we charge vehicles, certain types of vehicles, for driving on certain streets, and in particular, driving into more congested parts of the city. But again, it can be really hard to build the political will to enact those policies before we actually see the actual impact these companies have. And there are not a lot of great ways around that. On the one hand, if you're a city, you could say, sure, why don't you pilot this technology in a certain part of the city? Or you can only, deploy a couple vehicles on the streets. That's what's happening with autonomous vehicles right now. But the way you pilot these technologies also results in certain type of impacts. For example, with the e-scooters, when they were first launched and piloted in San Francisco, the city of San Francisco said you can only have them in this very small part of the downtown. And that meant that the people who use these e-scooters, for the most part, according to the city's survey data, were higher income white workers in downtown. The city of Oakland, on the other hand, took a little bit more hands-off approach to regulating the e-scooters and said, okay, just deploy them wherever. We'll figure out how to regulate this and pilot this later on. And as my friend Warren Logan pointed out, who used to be the mayor of Oakland's advisor on transportation, we saw lower income young people of color riding scooters a lot more in Oakland compared to San Francisco. So the way that you first test out and pilot these technologies can have a huge impact on the outcomes they end up having. So it's easier said than done, but there are lots of ways to do it.
Thank you. Dr. Wilson, did you have a comment or a next question?
Additional question before we get to the questions that are in our Q&A. So this is a pretty hot topic, Professor Turner. I want to address kind of the land grab that's going on in Solano County. Of this mysterious land grab that we all just became privy to, or maybe some of our participants are just now hearing of, that's around the Travis Air Force Base and kind of what the plans are. If you could allude to what you know of as the plan for this space, and get our viewers, and many of which are not viewers, I'm sorry, participants, many of which are community members in Solano County, would love to know about this.
Sure. So I just put a link in the chat for everyone to take a look at. Hopefully that works. I just wrote an opinion piece in the New York Times about this last week. And I will say, I don't know any more about this plan in Solano County than the rest of us, than what's been published. I do know some people involved in it, but they haven't told me any specific details. The link I put in the chat is for their website, where they share what they're willing to share about this plan. What we know is that a secretive group called Flannery Associates has been buying up agricultural land around Travis Air Force Base in rural Solano County by the Delta. And they bought a lot of land. They have spent about $800 million, according to the New York Times, purchasing this land. And it was revealed a couple weeks ago that the people funding this and behind it are some of the biggest names in the tech industry. Mark Andreessen, Michael Moritz, Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn, Steve Jobs' widow, Laureen Powell Jobs. These are gazillionaires who are very influential in the tech world, and that their plan is to build an entire new city from scratch. And as far as I understand it, it is intended to be an extremely large, dense city, denser than San Francisco. That's what we know about this plan. In the article that I wrote for the Times, I make the point that this is not the first time this has happened. We, over recent years, have seen a number of tech titans who have been wildly successful building tech startups decide in their retirement years to build new cities from scratch. There are the Seasteaders, funded by PayPal founder Peter Thiel, who want to build new cities floating in the ocean that can form their own governments and don't have to deal with all of the pesky politics of existing governments. There's Larry Page, the founder of Google, and he tried to build a new neighborhood outside of Toronto through a group called Sidewalk Labs that was an offshoot of Google. They had actually and still have very public plans about what to build in Toronto, but at the beginning of the pandemic, pulled out. So that project is no longer happening. But there are a number of these plans. Pretty much any big tech mogul that you can think of has proposed one of these new city plans. And I am not a huge fan of them. I argue in this piece that a lot of these plans tend to focus on new technologies and how to deploy them. It's not surprising a lot of these folks have invested in tech startups that have had trouble deploying their technologies in cities. And so they want a place where there's more freedom to do that. I also argue that as frustrated as they might be with our existing cities, we can't give up on them because that's where the rest of us live. and that building these new cities from scratch, I think, is just a distraction from fixing the cities we live in today. And that all of this money they've spent investing in new cities and all of the media attention that has been focused on it would be better spent, invested in, and focus on things like how to fix our transportation problems so our transit systems don't completely run out of money, or how to build more affordable housing near jobs where people already work. So I don't know what's going to happen with this project in Solano County, but I'm keeping a close eye on it. And I know the New York Times reporters are too. So as is the San Francisco Chronicle, which has had really excellent coverage of it. So stay tuned.
And how would you encourage our students? Most of our students are have some sort of they're either in our public health program or part of our dual program, or have an interest in public health. How would you suggest that our students take a role in addressing policy? Because this technology really does affect many aspects of public health, and social justice in particular.
Mm-hmm.
With this land grab, it may directly affect the surrounding city in areas around in a really inequitable way, and pooling resources in particular that could go towards kind of existing areas that are underfunded in Solano County. So how would you suggest that our students become engaged in these issues?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In fact, the director of the Economic Development Agency for Solano County, that's based in Vallejo, wrote an opinion piece in the San Francisco Chronicle last week, saying it's a shame that these folks want to build a new city on agricultural land, which the county has very intentionally preserved, because the city of Vallejo has long wanted and needed more investment in housing and jobs and development, and has the space and has the transit connections. And he wished that that attention and money was focused on Vallejo, which I would agree with. How to get involved? I imagine there's going to be an emerging advocacy movement tied to this Solano County plan. I don't know what that's going to look like. I am not involved with it, but I imagine it has inspired a lot of people to get more involved in the urban plans in the county. And for this project in particular, as I understand it, it requires all of the residents in the county to vote to change the allowed use from agricultural to residential or whatever other use to allow it to be built. So eventually, any voter in the county is going to have an opportunity to have their say. Until then, how to get involved just in like urban tech in general and new technologies that are impacting outcomes that you care about. It can be hard because sometimes these new technologies are not well known. When they do launch, usually they try and make big news. So if you read the local news, that's a good way to stay tuned. I can share some outlets that cover it. One that's really great is Bloomberg City Lab. Covers a lot of stuff with urban tech. Nextcity.org is another one. That both really pay attention to how new technologies are impacting urban life. So on the one hand, I would say follow what's happening and watch what's happening. And then secondly, I would say, as someone who has worked in the tech industry in years and been on the receiving end of this, don't be afraid to reach out to these companies. For the most part, they welcome feedback. And if they don't, they should. And in my experience, a lot of these companies are built by usually young people with grand ambitions and world-changing ideas that may not have a ton of experience in the issue area that they're hoping to impact. And they're hungry to talk to and learn from people who are experts in that. And so there could very well be opportunities for you to advise them either formally or informally and give them your feedback about what you think would work or not. And if you reach out to them early enough, you may actually have an ability to inform how they build these technologies and how they build these businesses and change what types of outcomes they might have had. So before you complain about the technologies, I would say try and reach out and see what you can learn and see what you can share with them, because you may actually have an ability to work with them. And for those technologies that I think are promising, where you're actually really excited about it, you know, maybe there's a new career path for you. I, as an urban planner, never in a million years thought I would end up working in the tech world. I thought I would work in city government my whole career. But when I saw a company like Airbnb emerge and realized that they didn't really have any sense of the types of impacts they were going to have on cities or how they were regulated, I realized, oh, they might be able to use someone like me who can help them think through their impacts on cities. So similarly, any of you might have that opportunity as well.
Well, I really love that answer, Molly, because I think, as public health professionals and students in public health, one of the things that we focus on is looking at ways to advocate on behalf of lots of different things. And I think one of the things we haven't really invested time and energy into is seeking ways to partner with organizations as they do build kind of these new technologies as another means. But I also really appreciate, and we're so grateful for these journalists that do seem to be leading the way to opening our eyes to some of these things that are happening, that for a lot of these issues seem to be happening behind closed doors. I mean, it should be public knowledge.
And I should add, it can be hard when your day job is focused on, really important things. And it can be it can feel like a distraction to say, oh, look at this new shiny technology over here. I should refocus my time on that. But we've learned over the past decade or so that these new technologies can grow really quickly and can transform things that we care about really quickly. And so I've actually seen, whereas when Uber and Lyft, for example, first launched, it was really hard for city leaders to kind of spend time figuring out what to do about them until it was too late, until they were too big. Now city leaders pay a lot of attention to what early stage startups are doing. And for example, with the scooters, when the scooters came along later, I've never seen the city of San Francisco move as quickly as they did to figure out how to regulate e-scooters, because they took it so seriously from the beginning and said, these could actually be really great for our cities or really horrible, and we need to figure this out before they get too big. So similarly, it can be hard to balance your attention when you've got a lot of competing demands. But I would say use your judgment to decide which of these technologies are worth your time and where you think you can have an important impact.
No, that's great. And I'm going to pivot to a few questions that we have in our chat. And first one is from Arthur Camargo, who's asking about one of the technologies that he didn't hear about was the use of modular reactors for communities. There was a talk about utilizing these as a resource or a source of energy that's green and not very expensive.
Nuclear reactors, I'm assuming?
Modular reactors.
Yeah, that's not something I'm super familiar with. Of course, there's there are so many technologies that I didn't address because there just wasn't enough time. But there's so many new technologies being developed for nuclear. That's what I thought. There are so many new technologies being developed for energy in a space that we often call climate tech. And the Inflation Reduction Act that Congress just passed has provided a lot of financial incentives and subsidies for these. And so that's one area where we're actually seeing a lot of investment into new climate tech startups. And there's a lot of promise there. So whether it's modular nuclear reactors, which I haven't heard of, or like the heat pumps, like I mentioned, or battery storage so that we can create, smarter, more adaptive grids. There are a lot of exciting things happening in climate world.
Interesting. Yeah, obviously we would be here until midnight if you kind of covered all new technology. So no, we appreciate that. And I do want to ask this next question because it's interesting. Both of my children live in sort of an ADU. I'm just learning about this language, or granny flat, I think is the layman's term for it. So someone is asking, what are your thoughts about AB 1033, sold by homeowners to create this kind of affordable housing as an option?
I'm Googling AB 1033 to make sure I have the right one because I can't keep track of all of the latest ones, but is it the latest amendment to the ADU laws that the state passed?
Yeah, and I don't know when that.
I think it is. I'll just talk about like the ADU laws in general. I am allowing the ADUs to be sold as condos. So my colleagues in the Turner Center for Housing Innovation, which is at UC Berkeley, has done a lot of research into ADUs and has actually informed a lot of the policy making in Sacramento around ADUs. So if you're interested in it, I would point you to the Turner Center, spelled differently than my name, TERNER, Center for Housing Innovation. And I largely agree with what they have said publicly about ADUs. ADUs are a great way to sneak in hidden density into our existing cities. A lot of buildings already have garages, and if they don't have a garage, they have space in a back or side yard to add a small unit. And in fact, those types of places, the places that have bigger lots with space for a unit like this, are really hard to build higher density housing in because of our existing zoning and also just because of the economics, because you can't build a bigger building there. So it requires smaller mom and pop developers to build, smaller multi-unit buildings. And that's just proven to be challenging, at least in California. Other states have had more success with that, namely Seattle actually has a lot more of that infill housing. So I think ADUs are a great way to sneak in this density. There are some challenges with them. One is not everybody can afford to build or purchase a prefabricated ADU to put in their backyard. So who gets to add these units is one question. And there are a lot of organizations and in fact, tech startups that I've worked with that are trying to come up with creative solutions to finance these so that they can be built in all different types of neighborhoods. Another question is who uses them, right? So one of the reasons why people are excited about ADUs is they're, quote, affordable by design. They're small. And so they don't cost as much both to build and also to live in. And so just by design, they inherently tend to be more affordable. And also because of their locations in someone's backyard, they tend to be in neighborhoods with greater opportunities. So they're also in places where we need more smaller, affordable units for people. And there are some critiques, which I think you're getting to with this question, that by allowing an ADU to be rented out as an Airbnb or to be sold as a condo, that's going to make them less affordable. That might be true, but my position is that we just need these things built. If in the next 5 or 10 years, they're not immediately used as affordable housing for someone, they might be in the future. If they get built, they can be there for decades if they're built well. We just need to add more units. And this is a great way to do it. And surprisingly to me, this is one of the bright spots. There have been a lot of new housing laws passed in Sacramento lately. This is one that we've actually seen have an impact and has increased housing supply. So I am cautiously optimistic that it can help, but it's not gonna solve our housing crisis on its own, but it's one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, it is fascinating because I think that the terminology I think is really interesting, sort of the differentiation between that and the in-law unit versus.
Yeah, there's so many different people kind of use them loosey-goosey. Yeah, an in-law unit is usually referring to like a basement unit that can be converted. That's kind of a similar idea as well. Just what's an easy unit that we can add as kind of like an appendage to a single family home?
Yeah, thank you for that.
Take this discussion a little further based on a question we received from Robin Cox, who is also one of our community members from Vallejo. And so some of us took tours of Factory OS on Mare Island, which makes modular homes. And she wants to know how we can advocate for the use of these types of modular homes to house people and families who would like to have housing or a small home, how we can fund them really to, as you stated, increase housing supply, but also possibly provide housing for the unhoused. So, and one of the examples that you gave during the presentation, you showed how we could convert office spaces and other unused buildings that have structure there, but actually like pop in a kitchen. So how can we advocate for the repurposing of these kinds of structures?
That's a great question. So it's already happening, and it could happen a lot more, but I'll share a couple examples. So first of all, in terms of the repurposing of existing structures, the state has a program called Project Home Key that started a couple years ago in the depths of the pandemic, where it provided subsidies to convert hotels that were underutilized into housing for people exiting homelessness. And a lot of these conversions have happened. Coincidentally, my brother has a couple of these projects that he's doing right now in the East Bay, converting hotels into housing for people to exit homelessness. And one of the promising ways to make that easier is to use like a modular kitchen like this to decrease the cost of doing that, because you've got a hotel room that's already got, the window and the bathroom. It doesn't have the kitchen. So is that one way you could do that? So that's already happening, not at a large scale, but it's already happening. Factory OS. I know the folks at Factory OS well, and in fact, Bridge Housing, the nonprofit affordable housing developer I'm on the board of, just finished a project with Factory OS in Mission Bay in San Francisco. So we have done a modular project with them. And that project, I can't remember the specific details of it, but we built housing using subsidies from federal, state, and local government for people who are below median income significantly. And so our housing is subsidized affordable housing. That project is one of those projects. And there are probably some people who have exited homelessness who are now residents in that building. Factory OS is mostly, as far as I understand, doing multifamily housing like the one I just mentioned that Bridge did, where it's building apartment buildings for a lot of nonprofit housing developers who do subsidized housing. There is an interesting opportunity for a company like Factory OS to build tiny homes like those that you've seen in Oakland. The city of Oakland has experimented with those. Tiny homes that could create little villages for people experiencing homelessness. And that might be an interesting way for some of these factories like Factory OS to kind of have a more steady customer base and create more steady labor for the factory. Because you can imagine, if you're running a factory, you can't do like, oh, we're going to build one huge building and then we're going to, pause for a long time before we build another. You need kind of like a steady flow of manufacturing and of customers. And so perhaps, building tiny homes like this could end up being something else that they do in addition to these bigger apartment buildings. But we haven't seen, there's other companies working on that, but we haven't seen that reach scale yet. So it's definitely something that's in the works. And I bet you in the next 3 years, you're going to see some of these tiny home villages that were built with modular housing popping up in neighborhoods around the East Bay.
Thank you so much. I think, this is an opportunity for us to advocate and keep watch so that we can support any of these initiatives that will create housing for the unhoused population in our county.
Yeah. And I know we have a couple of other questions in the chat, but I kind of want to go back to what you mentioned earlier, and it just prompted my memory on your podcast in Technopolis when you spoke with, I believe it was a set designer for Black Panther.
Mm-hmm.
It's really a fascinating conversation, and it just reminded me of sort of the cross-disciplinary nature of what it we're just trying to imagine or reimagine a society that is for future thinking, future focused thinking, and really holding on to our values as a society. And that's kind of what I gained from that conversation. And I do recall one of the questions that you asked was for the fantasy country Wakanda. You asked why you didn't have people in self-driving cars and why we were still on the bus. And that stuck with me. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So we did a podcast episode interviewing Hannah Beachler, who is the set designer for Black Panther, and won an Academy Award for the first Black Panther for her set design. And when that movie came out, a bunch of nerdy urban planners like me got really excited, because even though the scenes in the Golden City of Wakanda were a very small portion of the overall film, they really caught our attention. Because a lot of times in futuristic films that are showing future cities, first of all, oftentimes they're dystopic. The city is kind of a hellscape, and there's it's a surveillance state, and the main characters are running around corners and hiding. When they're not dystopic, they tend to be littered with all kinds of technologies that really don't create the best urban experience. And what Hannah did in the first Black Panther, and I actually haven't seen the second one yet, so I don't know what she's done with that one. But in the first one, what she did was she wrote like a 300-page book explaining to the rest of the film crew what the city would look like and how it would operate. And she was very intentional about that. The city was utopian, and it ran on, I forget the name of the energy source that everything ran on there, but it ran on this kind of fantastical futuristic energy source. And it had all of these fantastical, amazing technologies, including these fast vibranium, thank you, including these, yes, and Ryan Coogler, the filmmaker, is from Oakland and went to high school with one of my good friends. So go East Bay. She had, you could see these like high-speed trains going through the Golden City of Wakanda that were powered by vibranium. But you didn't see flying cars, which is so often one of the technologies in futuristic movies.
They're always in the air.
They're always in the air. Back to the Future, there's one. There's so many. I'm not a movie buff, but you can all imagine them. And that was just really refreshing to me. Not only that, the other thing that people loved was The main way of getting around the Golden City of Wakanda was the train or the bus, was public transit, not a private autonomous vehicle. And there were people all over the streets. The street wasn't just controlled by these new transportation technologies. They were just filled with people. And it looked like such a vibrant place where people were more important than the technology. So we interviewed her to ask her thinking behind that. And that was very intentional, and just really refreshing, for someone to be really putting people at the center of their futuristic visions over the technology. And so I recommend that everyone listen. That was one of my favorite podcast interviews of all time. I recommend you listen to her, and talking about it is reminding me that I need to see her latest installment and see what she did. I hope she didn't put flying cars in the next one.
No, there weren't any flying
Good.
cars. A lot going on, but no flying cars. Thank you. No, I appreciate that. That was something that I really held on to, was that important piece of putting people first before the technology. And I think that's not always the case when we are thinking about the best, the brightest, the shiniest.
Exactly. Just like my example about autonomous vehicles on a rainy day, right? If you're solving the problem for the technology, for the vehicle, it leads to a very different solution than if you're solving the problem for the people who need to get around. And that's the best piece of advice I can give everybody, is to focus on the people over the technology.
Well, Professor Turner, I think that is the perfect spot to conclude our session today, putting people over technology as we kind of move forward in the technologies that we've been using, and that we see will be used in both public health and the built environment, as we reflect on how or if we use this technology to solve problems. So we really do appreciate your time with us this evening. And we look forward to listening to your next installment of your podcast, Technopolis. We're waiting.
I am too. We'll get there.
And we'll definitely be in touch with you all. Thank you again for participating this evening.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you all for your excellent questions.
Have a good night, everyone.